Philosophy, questioning, enlightenment, deep conversation, spirituality. This is the spiritual download.
The situation in the world right now is going to be different for different people. I mean, it's like we all have our own individual lessons, and some of these lessons seem to be more collective than others and affect large groups of people and hit people in different ways. This, in one of the ways, and maybe on the more pessimistic end, if you could put that word to it, that I sort of frame what's going on now, is it's a bit of a dress rehearsal. Yeah, I find it to be a bit of a dress rehearsal for deeper, for the effects that I think are a little bit unavoidable with deeper problems that we're facing, environmental problems especially. And in fact, one could look at this COVID-19 situation as being an extension or deeply interconnected with our environmental problems. All of these species jumping diseases and species jumping viruses that get out of the world. We also have those now that the permafrost is melting up in Canada. We have all of these ancient bacteria that are starting to reawaken, of which we might not have antibiotics that are effective. So we might be launching into very difficult times. Not to mention the sort of the collapse of fisheries, the collapse of insect populations, the collapse of sea life in general. These are great challenges that many in the spiritual community. I don't necessarily use the term magical thinking. Actually, for me, it's a positive term. But many in the spiritual community often kind of want to think they can magic certain things away or get around it. And while I'm sentimental to that possibility and have had miraculous things happen in my life, at the same time, I think there are things that where the butcher's bill is really kind of coming due. And so for me, the most important thing, say with my meditation students, and it's kind of always been this way for me just because of my orientation, but the most important thing is in facing up to fear, is in using meditation as a tool, or I should say that one of the great byproducts of that tool is overcoming fear, is contacting the shadow, is diving down, deep into the substratum of consciousness, into levels that we don't normally touch, and in so doing, releasing, healing, exposing an awful lot of material, a lot of tension, fear, and beautiful talents that we store down there. And events like this, events like wars, pandemics, trying events, often have the rather salubrious effect of pushing more and more people into those spaces where they otherwise wouldn't go. So in that case, yeah, the joyful part is that for some who are fortunate enough, it's like an enforced spiritual retreat, a silent retreat, a going inward. And if one can use that, take advantage of this time in that way, then I highly recommend anybody out there to do that. So that's kind of the first facet that I think of. What's happening in the world.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about how when all of human beings start to slow down, how would the earth feel that, or how would someone who's very kind of entrenched in their spirituality, where they can maybe feel some of the vibrations of the earth, and when human beings slow down, what does that look like, or what does that do to that meditator or the earth?
It looks wonderful here in the Portuguese countryside, but seriously, we overconsume. You know, we do. There are we're coming up on 8 billion soon. If we haven't passed it already, I haven't checked the population clock, but we certainly have been over consuming. We're consuming the world to death. And that is one of the silver linings, is that as we sort of lay off quite a bit, as our economy shuts down, of course, there are there are very negative effects there. But at the same time, as our economy is forced to shut down, yeah, nature is rebounding. Here for me, I'm going to get a little bit mystical and woo-woo. I feel things energetically. My whole life, everything feels like music. Nature is this sort of beautiful symphony. Every blade of grass, the trees, the sheep around us, the bees that are going at the borage plants outside. All of it has this music to it. In our human world, we have a tendency of sort of droning it out, of drowning that, of becoming disconnected to it, so that when we do pull back and kind of in some ways have a temporary deindustrialization like we're having right now, yeah, I hope that people are able to have the wherewithal to slow down with it and be able to tune into all of those sort of natural rhythms that we've been suppressing, or that we've been missing because we're otherwise too busy, or we're running weed whackers all the time, or we're mining the shit out of the mountains, or whatever the hell that we're doing.
Yeah. So what are some ways that people, like, if the slowing down kind of stresses them out, or they feel a sense of fear from the slowing down, what are some ways that you can reduce the fear within this slowing down process?
Well, if you already have a good meditation practice, lean into that. If you don't, I'd suggest getting one and getting connected with one, because that's an indispensable tool. Even with a meditation practice, there might be some, sort of sweating things out a little bit. That's just natural. We kind of build up these habits where we stress and tense our nervous systems in certain ways, and then when suddenly we stop doing that, yeah, there can be a freak out. And there's often no way of bypassing that freak out. So just understand that it's okay. If you have a good meditation practice, even it's okay if you've got, if you're having emotional reactions, because those have been there. Those are basically the structures of tension, the habits of looking away from, fundamental consciousness that are now releasing whatever gunk that has sort of accrued over a lifetime in your mind and body. So it's okay. Just be with it. There's no way to, and it's not really desirable to try to push it away as an experience, because it's there. It's what you have to face. It's something that one has neglected for many, many years. And in spirituality and spiritual development, a big chunk of the path is coming into contact with all those things that we've neglected and pushed away. So have courage, fear not. And if you do fear's okay. Fear's natural. Everything is there to be embraced.
So what role does fear play in the spiritual path?
Well, it's something that we all have to encounter. It's not that it's, I suppose, specific to the spiritual path, but it's specific to human life. It's a natural reaction, and first and foremost, and then it's also something, of course, that we might say is a little bit more artificial, because it comes up. It's produced by the little identity structure that we start to see ourselves as, and that, of course, that little identity structure, it's not an easy situation to be identified as that little self. You're like a billiard ball in a world full of other billiard balls that are, conspiring to smack you or break your leg or have you lose your job or have you go hungry, have you die. It's all of those are there in the background. And so as we sort of disentangle, that sort of netting, that structure of the little separate self begins to dissolve, it's almost as if a lot of that stuff comes up in the form of thoughts or emotions, and often fear. As we disentangle, it's almost as if we sort of there's the tendency to experience maybe the initial conditioning, the initial reason for our various conditionings, which is often fear. We want to protect ourselves. We want to protect the little self. And so there's often that little, tendency to grasp again, or we could say we often experience it, because it's kind of happening our whole lives in the background. But since we're so distracted, there's so much noise, we might not experience it. But as we slow down, as our mind begins to become quieter, then we start to notice all those things that are in the background. And
what role does our little self play as we're going down this path? Theoretically, we're opening up to this big part of ourselves that we've never discovered before, or maybe we've had little insights towards it. But what role does that little self continue to play as you go down that path?
I mean, it's ultimately divine, just as much as anything else. We need to have this vehicle for experiencing the world, and we could, in Sanskrit, we could call it the lesha vidya, the last remains of ignorance, and it has an important role to play. It becomes a vessel even to contain, I'd say, the love and the brilliance and the beauty and the joy of Brahman, of the experience of higher consciousness. Of course, up to that point, there's a lot of bullshit, before that. And so if that's all we know, if we're almost wholly identified with that, then we're suffering because we don't know, we haven't delved sufficiently into the rest of our nervous system. We've kept ourselves to, it's like if we had a big mansion to live in, that was our nervous system. We've sort of cloistered ourselves into the worst possible part of the house. And so that's, the worst possible part of the house to have be the only thing that we know. And so what first we have to do is we have to know the greater self that's there. We have to tap into that fundamental consciousness. We could call it samadhi, turiya, the peace that passes all understanding. And as we jump into that ocean from the shore and go deeper into it, then eventually, we're not trying to kill our previous point of view. That's silly. We're not trying to kill the ego. The wave is a natural part of the whole ocean. We're just changing our context to know the ocean. And when we do that, then having the wave still there is a joyful occasion. The ocean then gets to express itself through something. And the ocean gets to experience life through a vehicle. And so then the purpose is joy. It's like that, that old saying, first there's a mountain, then there's no mountain, then there's a mountain again. The first mountain is full of knotty contradictions and dubious structures of identification and all sorts of projection, and it has to be dissolved. We have to sort of level that in that no mountain place, and the no mountain is transcendental consciousness. And so when we come to know that transcendental consciousness for long enough, then lo and behold, if we keep going, the mountain comes. The mountain returns, it's back, only it's not made of bullshit. It's been cleansed. And so that mountain, lo and behold, is consciousness itself. And it was the whole time. We just were misidentifying what was in front of us. And that's I think a wonderful analogy for the spiritual journey.
Can you explain, because you've mentioned before the idea of unmanifested consciousness. Can you describe the difference between manifested and unmanifested consciousness?
Sure. Oh yeah, that's well, unmanifest consciousness, the way I use it in any event, is basically the same as I would say the, sort of the infinite, the unbound, the Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. That's the first line of the Tao Te Ching, and that's basically pointing and saying, look, there's this space that we all know. There's this level of experiencing that we've all touched, and when you try to put a name to it, you've just gone out of it a little bit. There's a part of ourselves in which you can't box up at all, which you can't throw a conceptual net around and say, I've got it, because it's so vast and so huge and so big. And so its qualities are infinite. That's what we're touching in samadhi. That's what we're touching in deep meditation. Those are the waters that we're bathing in, that are sufficiently large that they're able to dissolve the Gordian knot of our ego, to cleanse the thickest bramble of internal conditioning. And so that's the unmanifest. And everything that you can put a name to, everything that you can sort of say, I mean, for the purpose of this conversation, is manifest. Ultimately, the manifest is unmanifest as well, actually, and that gets a little bit, that's down the road. But for a while, it's good to have that distinction between unmanifest and manifest, because we're so used to we most of us, we grow up and we sort of get caught in the world of concepts and boxes and little selves and things, and it's just a mess. And so the first step is to go from that mess and to touch the thing that is absolutely not messy, that is unboxable, and that's the unmanifest.
So what is non-duality then?
Non-duality, Advaita. Well, it's not having a border. It's not just, some people might characterize it as sitting in that unmanifest space, because that unmanifest space is an absolutely non-dual space. There's no room for duality, because there's no self and there's no other. There's no I and thou anymore. That's the ultimate experiential foundation and root of non-dual consciousness is touching that unmanifest, boundless space. Beyond that, though, it's more than just touching it. It's more than just maybe have what we used to say, like, you've learned, it, and now you keep it in your back pocket, and then you kind of go on. You kind of let a lot of your conditioning sort of still be there as you move through the world, or you might know the space, and you might look at the people around you, or look at the lamp, or the world in general, and see it still as kind of a separate sort of thing. Well, that's not non-dual quite yet. And so true non-duality is when that distinction is when the distinction between self and other, self and world, becomes increasingly porous, and unto the point where there's a sense of being one with it. Almost like having the world as one's own body, which sounds like a very trippy sort of experience. We all have, it's a very natural and grounded experience to understand that, this hand is attached to this body. It's something that a sense that we sort of take for granted, that, oh, okay, yeah, it's so basic. That same sort of thing can be experienced with other people, with the computer that's in front of you. At the same time, we can also know that, there's a body over here, and there's a computer over there, and there's a tree over there, and there's, all the things that we've learned about the world don't just go away, but there's something deeper underneath. there's a deeper sense of unity that's there at the same time, and that's non-duality right there. Having the world as yourself, seeing yourself in the world.
So sometimes if someone has an experience of this, why does it stick for some people, and then other people they might forget it for, most of the rest of their life?
Well, I don't know. We all have different destinies, I suppose, and we all have different paths. And we're kind of like fruit. We ripen at different times. One person might get come into the world, and it's as if this person, all they have to really do is just kind of fall out of bed, and by doing so they fall into this experience. Another person might have to work their asses off, and really cultivate, and most people are somewhere in the middle, and it's just so variable. We all have different cooking times, and there's no one size fits all kind of formula that exists. There's too many variables, and that's why when I sort of started, I was reading these books. I was saying, like, God, these books are telling me it's going to take 40 lifetimes. And so I was basically, okay, I'm just going to assume I'm on life 0. So I've got my work cut out for me, and I'm just not going to worry about it. And so the only thing that I control, if there is free will, but I came to the decision that the only thing that I could control is sit and meditate right now, and then the next moment, and then the next moment, and then the next moment, and just keep plodding on. Let's see what happens. Let's see what kind of experiential terrain we're going to run into. Let's see what kind of transformation is going to happen. So the TM organization, for instance, for a while they used to say, oh, just do your TM, maybe this many minutes or hours in a day. In 5 to 8 years, you'll be in the first stage of enlightenment. Then when 5 to 8 years started to come up for people, and they like, well, I don't know what's going on, they kind of had to revise that. So I don't usually do that with people. I wouldn't say, take 2 of these and call me in 5 to 8 years.
So how can someone find their meditation practice? What are some ways for that?
God. Well, you could be an experimenter. That's one way of doing it. Throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at the problem. That's certainly a sort of learning style that I have employed many times in life. But there's also resonance, and if there's resonance and there's intuition, which can sort of shortcut the long experimental process. And that, of course, might be an experiment in itself, because as we're opening up to resonance, as we're opening up to intuition, it's quite reasonable to be unsure. Is this just a hunch, that's not based in anything deeper, or is this something deeper like intuition? We often don't know. So there's also sort of an experimenting in that. But once we sort of have enough, experiential backup, then we're kind of saying, like, okay, I am tuning into something here. There is some sort of guidance system that's available, that's in my heart, that's in my mind, the deeper mind, that's wherever we put it. So maybe some people feel things in their knees, I don't know. There is something deeper. And so tuning into that as much as possible, listening to that, once we know that there's a real thing to be tuned into there, tuning into it and following its directives instead of just sort of blowing it off. Because it's often the tendency that we just sort of, we have a hunch, we have a real deep intuition, but if we blow it off too many times, it's like, we haven't sort of cultivated the ability to listen. But if we follow it, then our ability to listen deepens. And then the next time we might be able to tune into an even more refined and subtle channel, and it grows and grows and grows. And for me, I was trying, different meditations, whatever came through my hometown or whatever was taught to me by a mentor that I felt, sort of a resonance with. And at a certain point, I was monastery shopping, and which you could do in the late 90s, early 2000s. They would even send you little brochures. And so I was looking at these places, and there just wasn't quite a resonance yet. I could feel that here in my heart. And I prayed. I prayed to Babaji because I had read Yogananda's autobiography, and I knew that I wasn't really on my path yet, and I deeply wanted to be placed on my path. And so he in some part of that book said, anybody who prays to Babaji, will have their prayers heard. So I prayed to Babaji like a motherfucker, basically. And just every night in my deepest part of meditation, I would put the signal out, and whether it was Babaji or some other benevolent being or my own higher self, I started sort of receiving a kind of a blast of deepened intuition. It felt like a golden light that came down through the top of my head and just was there. And nothing special, but I had the sense that I was supposed to sort of tune into that frequency, and it would pop up here and there. And one of the times where it popped up the most was when I was coming home so I was picking up cigarette butts from the streets of my hometown, putting them in a garbage bag. I came home, and there was my soon-to-be brother-in-law at the door saying, "Hey, do you want to come to Minneapolis this weekend and go to this meditation workshop?" And immediately it was like a cannon shot out of my chest. I was like, yes, because that resonance was there. And I surprised the hell out of myself because I was kind of a party pooper in those days. I wouldn't do anything but my meditation schedule. I was very rigid and very defensive about that. And here I was, I'm going to go to some workshop. Didn't even like the word workshop or seminar. I thought, oh, these are lightweight sorts of things, not for me. And there I was. So, I mean, it's not necessarily repeatable. We all have our own path. We all have our own sequence. We all are different instruments, and we have to sort of learn about our own instrument and learn how to tune in and follow. But I've had too many of my friends who ended up in ashrams have had very similar stories.
So I guess kind of a follow-up question is, what meditation was it in Minneapolis that you encountered, or can you tell us the story of what you saw there in Minneapolis?
Yeah, I love Minneapolis. No, no, because you're from there. But yeah, it was this meditation practice called the Yeshaya's Ascension. It's the one that I still practice and have been teaching for many years. And it's actually kind of funny because I had encountered this practice several times before in the previous years, and just kind of blew it off each time. Like on the internet, I somehow happened upon the website, and I was just not attracted to the wording or the graphics. I was like, that doesn't seem interesting, and it just kind of kept coming in different ways, and so there I was. So when I went to this workshop, I was in the basement of a chiropractic clinic, and there were two teachers in the front of the room wearing monochromatic clothing. And, my first sort of reaction was like, oh dear, this doesn't look very promising at all. But I was there, and I was committed I was a spiritual experimenter, and I was there to run an experiment. What is it going to be like if I do this practice and run it through my nervous system? So it's quite open-minded in that sense, open-minded but skeptical. And so as I sat there and learned this technique, I definitely didn't believe that it was going to work. Yeah, so I approached this thing as a sort of a spiritual experimentalist. So I was quite open, but quite skeptical at the same time, and kind of both together. I was in going for the empirical test. And so I sat down, and as they sort of started to walk us through the first technique, or the meditation form, I was quite skeptical. I was like, this isn't going to work, like what? And happily the teachers were responsive somehow to my inner needs, or because they at the same time turned their heads and actually talked at once to me, and said, like, and even if you completely disbelieve in the practice, it'll work just fine. And I kind of gave them a thumbs up from where I was sitting. So I went in, and as I closed my eyes and went into meditation in a very different way than I'd been meditating. I was doing before this often a lot of concentration meditations. So there was a lot of tension and strain, and those muscles were being worked. And so this practice was effortless, and I was using kind of prayer mantras, little seed thoughts, and I'd never really put much stock in that, or hadn't been practicing in that way before. And so as I thought these prayer mantras, I also let whatever thoughts that wanted to come up just come, which was different for me. I let my mind go out, and then I would gently come back to these prayer mantras. And of course, what my mind was, most of that first meditation, besides thinking, okay, am I doing this right the way they want me to? Do I have it right? The other thoughts were basically, oh my God, this is bullshit probably. And I was like, oh, but it's only one weekend. That's not long. So no big loss, it's not the biggest loss in the world. You're just whatever. And those are the thoughts that were running through my mind. And all of a sudden I started to experience where these techniques were taking me. And I started to, even as I had those thoughts, even as those clouds were moving across the sky of my mind, there was this vastness that opened up. This doesn't happen with everybody. So I often don't, tell the story at classes, because I don't want people to get discouraged. But all of a sudden, this vast silence was there, and I fell into it. And the thoughts were sort of still there, but they were like gentle little wavelets at the top of a much deeper consciousness. I felt as big as the building, as big as the world, doing this. And I would sort of gently rise up, and I would introduce this prayer mantra called an ascension attitude, and it would just take me down like a gentle dive into this deep space. And I was hooked, basically. That was at the same time, my body, which was often tense because I was fasting too much probably, and Mr. trying to be fruitarian, and really pushing my mind and body very hard before that. And so I noticed how relaxed my body had become. Even as at the beginning, as I was thinking a lot of thoughts, I was like, what the hell? My hand's asleep. Jesus, what's going on here? This is so relaxed. And that was my predominant experience for the rest of the weekend, was diving into this vast place, but also at the same time having, it was as if I'd become part of a circuit, a big conduit, and all of this energy was rushing up my torso, and it was very pleasant, like a electric wind was coming up my legs and going up my torso. At the same time, there was this sense of having this really pleasant, really pleasant kind of waterfall feeling coming down into my head, and coming into my body. So it was a very kind of very active weekend as well. These energetics were there. And on the way home from the class, it's a long drive from Minneapolis to Southeast Wisconsin. It must have been 6 to 8 hours or something like that. So we got in to my little town at about 1 or 2 in the morning. The streets were quiet. It was a winter night, but I was looking out at the lake, And I noticed that the lake was alive. Because there were streetlights in my town, the surroundings were much more visible than the dark highway in between the cities. And so I could see outside, and the lake was completely alive. In fact, it felt that there was no difference between my consciousness and the lake. There was this very pronounced non-local sense that, I was certainly not ending at this body. And I was in this body, but as also in the trees outside, in the streetlights, in the snow, in the lake. And as I sort of moved my awareness around these different things, I was as if interacting with different flavors of nature. I was seeing, which was not necessarily usual for the time, but I looked out in the lake and I saw these. I thought I was in like a Tchaikovsky play. I saw all these little dancing, bluish fairy type creatures on the parts of the lake that were frozen and the unfrozen part. And that was wild, and kind of this kept on. And underneath all of this was this bubbling mirth that had been uncorked by that weekend. I felt so electrified, so alive. I hadn't felt that alive since I was a child, or since the days after my near-death experience. Those were the only two times that I could quite remember that feeling. And so, God, I must have went to bed at 3 or 4 in the morning. I was so buzzed that night, staying up, and I remember waking at 6 in the morning, so 2 or 3 hours of sleep, and I was just completely rested. And it's as if I was sleeping on the floor at that point. Actually, I slept on my yoga mat with a towel under my neck. That was my style back in those days. But I remember just springing up, and my dad was getting up, and he was like, "I'm going to the grocery store." And I was like, "Oh, I'll come." And there was just this elan, this effervescent vitality that was there and stayed and was there for quite some time, until I kind of normalized. But I was given a kind of flavor of what my nervous system could feel like with a lot of the gunk wrung out of it.